The last person to see Amelia Vance alive said she paused once before walking down the fog-shrouded path, the beam of her flashlight swallowed by the mist. In that final glance, her expression wasn't one of fear. It was something closer to resolve, as if she knew the path ahead was one she couldn't turn back from. If you're captivated by mysteries where the truth is buried for years under layers of silence and small-town loyalty, make sure you're subscribed, because this case will unravel everything you thought you knew about secrets kept by the sea. October in coastal Maine carries a chill that seeps right into your bones, a damp, salty cold that clings to you long after you've gone inside. It's not the biting, dry freeze of deep winter, but a persistent gloom that rolls in with the Atlantic fog. In 2003, that chill arrived early in the town of Port Clyde, a community of fewer than 2,000 people where granite shores met the churning sea and lobster boats were a more common sight than new faces. The landscape there is starkly beautiful, a place of jagged cliffs and whispering pines that seem to guard the town's long-held secrets. Amelia Vance was 18 when she drove her beat-up station wagon from Ohio to Maine that September. In the back were 2 boxes of books and an acceptance letter to Blackstone University, a small liberal arts college known for its marine biology program. She'd grown up in the landlocked Midwest, dreaming of oceans she'd only seen in pictures. Her father, a high school history teacher named Robert Vance, had been hesitant to let his only daughter go so far, but Amelia was fiercely independent. She was a serious student, with dark, curious eyes and a quiet determination that often surprised people. Her roommate, a boisterous local girl named Chloe, said Amelia seemed a bit overwhelmed by the brash, tight-knit culture of coastal Maine, but she was trying her best to fit in. The university was small, with fewer than 1,000 students. The campus was a collection of old brick buildings overlooking a rocky cove, constantly smelling of salt and damp earth. Amelia's dorm room was on the 3rd floor, with a single window that offered a sliver of a view of the gray, restless ocean. Chloe mentioned that Amelia would often sit by that window for hours, just watching the waves crash against the shore, lost in thought. Within the marine biology department, there was a long-standing, unsanctioned tradition. Every October, the seniors organized an initiation for the incoming freshmen. The university administration had tried to ban the practice after a student nearly drowned in the 90s, but such rituals have deep roots in isolated communities. They simply moved into the shadows. The upperclassmen spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones in the dining hall, framing it as a necessary trial, a rite of passage to prove one's mettle against the unforgiving sea. Amelia had heard the whispers. Chloe, whose older brother had gone through it, told her it was mostly just silly, harmless dares and a late-night trek along the coast. But she also noted that the senior in charge that year, a charismatic and reckless student named Evan Driscoll, had a reputation for taking things too far. On the evening of October 17, 2003, the phone in Amelia's dorm room rang. Chloe was studying in the common room, so Amelia answered it alone. The conversation was brief, less than a minute. When Chloe returned a little before 10, Amelia was pulling on a heavy wool sweater and her worn hiking boots. Her face was pale under the harsh fluorescent light. Chloe asked where she was going. Amelia said she had to meet some people at the old cannery, the abandoned one at the edge of Cutler Point. When Chloe asked if it was for the initiation, Amelia just nodded, her jaw set. Chloe recalled feeling a knot of anxiety in her stomach. Her friend looked scared, but also deeply resolute, as if she had to prove she wasn't an outsider. Amelia grabbed her favorite knitted scarf, a vibrant red one her grandmother had made, and left without another word. The old cannery was a skeleton of a building, abandoned since the fishing industry had declined in the 80s. It stood on a desolate point about 3 miles from campus, a place where the wind howled relentlessly and the sound of the ocean was a constant roar. The road out was unpaved and treacherous, especially in the fog. Local teenagers used the place to drink and dare each other to walk the crumbling catwalks over the churning water below. It was a place surrounded by nothing but sharp rocks, cold water, and the vast, indifferent darkness of the Atlantic. Amelia Vance walked into that darkness and vanished. The Port Clyde Police Department received the missing person report at 8:15 on the morning of October 18. The call came from Chloe, her voice trembling as she explained she'd woken up to find Amelia's bed still perfectly made. Initially, Officer Dave Miller, a veteran who had seen his share of college students pulling all-nighters, wasn't overly concerned. But Chloe was adamant. Amelia wasn't a partier. She was responsible. And she had gone to the old cannery. That last detail made Miller sit up straight. He'd pulled more than one reckless teenager out of that ruin over the years. Nothing good ever happened at the cannery after dark. By 9:30 a.m., 2 police cruisers were parked outside the derelict building, their flashing lights muted by the thick morning fog. The chain on the main gate was rusted but intact. The officers began a perimeter search, their boots sinking into the muddy ground, calling Amelia's name over the sound of the waves. There was no response. There were no fresh footprints near the entrance, no sign that a group had gathered, nothing to indicate anyone had been there at all. By early afternoon, the search had intensified. The state police sent a canine unit, a pair of German shepherds who immediately picked up a faint scent trail leading not from the cannery itself, but from the access road, heading south along the treacherous cliffside path. Volunteers from the university, students and faculty alike, formed a search line, moving slowly through the dense, wet underbrush. The temperature had plummeted overnight, and a cold rain had begun to fall. Everyone knew that if Amelia was out here, injured or lost, time was running out. Robert Vance arrived late that night, having driven non-stop from Ohio, his face a gray mask of exhaustion and fear. He'd gotten the call that morning and had barely registered the officer's words before grabbing his keys. Sergeant Frank Costello, a quiet, methodical man who had been with the department for 20 years, met him at the station. He had the weary, compassionate look of a man who knew how these stories often ended. Robert was taken to the search area, where he stood in the rain under the harsh glare of portable floodlights, watching teams search the cliffs, his son's name a constant, desperate refrain on the wind. Chloe found him there, her face streaked with tears and rain. She told him about the phone call, about Amelia's determination, about the red scarf she'd been wearing. She kept apologizing, saying she should have stopped her, should have gone with her. Robert, a man hollowed out by grief, simply pulled the girl into a hug, recognizing that her guilt was a burden she'd carry forever. The detail about the phone call was the first solid lead Sergeant Costello had. He questioned Chloe carefully. She hadn't heard who it was, but Amelia had seemed nervous. Costello knew this wasn't just a case of a student getting lost. If this was a university initiation, why was no one else coming forward? The police began interviewing the marine biology seniors that afternoon. Evan Driscoll was brought in first. He was tall, confident, and handsome, with an easy smile that vanished the second he stepped into the interview room. He denied everything. Sure, they'd talked about an initiation, but they'd called it off. Too risky, he said, with the dean threatening suspensions. He claimed he was at a bar in the next town over all night, and his girlfriend backed him up. Costello didn't buy it for a second. Other students told the same story, a little too perfectly. They'd heard rumors, but nothing had happened. No one admitted making a phone call. No one admitted being at the cannery. The wall of silence was absolute and immediate. As the sun failed to appear on the second day, hidden behind a ceiling of gray clouds, the search was officially suspended. Amelia Vance had been missing for over 24 hours. The temperature was near freezing, and a storm was rolling in off the Atlantic. Sergeant Costello stood on the cliff's edge, staring into the thick fog, a cold certainty forming in his gut. Somewhere out in that gray emptiness, a young woman was gone, and in the small, tight-lipped university on the hill, someone knew why. Weeks turned into a month, and the only break in the case came in mid-November. A lobsterman checking his traps in a remote, little-visited cove nearly 10 miles down the coast found something bright tangled in a buoy line. It was a sodden, salt-water-logged red scarf. Chloe identified it immediately as the one Amelia's grandmother had knitted for her. The discovery gave investigators very little. It was sent to the state crime lab, but after weeks in the turbulent Atlantic, any forensic evidence was long gone. It only confirmed what everyone feared, that Amelia had ended up in the water. But it didn't explain how or why, and its location, so far from the cannery, only deepened the mystery. By December, the active search was over. The Maine coast in winter is a brutal, unforgiving place of ice-slicked rocks and violent storms. The police officially suspended the search, and the reality that Amelia Vance could not have survived became an unspoken certainty in the town. The case remained open, but resources were quietly shifted to more immediate concerns. The university students went home for the holidays, taking their secrets with them. Robert Vance, however, did not go home. He quit his teaching job in Ohio, drained his savings, and rented a small, damp cottage on the edge of Port Clyde that always smelled of mildew and the low tide. He launched a website, searchingforamelia.org, posting her smiling high school photo and every detail of her disappearance. He printed thousands of flyers and drove up and down the coast, tacking them to telephone poles and general store bulletin boards from Kittery to Bar Harbor. He walked the cliffs every day, a grim, solitary figure staring out at the gray sea, calling his daughter's name into the wind. The locals watched him with a sad, weary pity. They knew the ocean. They knew it took people and rarely gave them back. In the spring of 2004, Robert hired a private investigator out of Boston, a retired state trooper who came highly recommended. The PI re-interviewed all the students, but he hit the same wall of silence. Evan Driscoll, now graduated and working for a marine research firm in Florida, stuck to his story. The other students, scattered to new lives, claimed to remember even less than they had before. The PI spent 2 months and the last of Robert's savings before concluding that without a body or a confession, the case was stalled indefinitely. In 2006, the Port Clyde Police Department officially reclassified the case as a probable drowning, a tragic accident. In a tense meeting, Sergeant Costello explained their theory: Amelia had likely slipped on the wet rocks near the cannery, fallen into the churning water, and been swept out to sea. The lack of a body was tragic but not uncommon. Robert stood up in the middle of the explanation, his hands shaking with a quiet rage, and told the officers that his daughter didn't just slip. Someone had lied, someone was still lying, and he would never stop searching for the truth. The years that followed were a blur of hollow grief. Robert's health declined. He took odd jobs, mending lobster traps, doing groundskeeping at the university he'd come to despise, anything to stay in Port Clyde, the last place his daughter had been alive. He kept the website active, a digital ghost that few people visited anymore except for a handful of online sleuths. He returned to the cliffs every October 17th, lighting a single candle that the sea wind always extinguished. By 2010, he was a fixture in the town, a sad monument to a tragedy most people wanted to forget. The university, for its part, quietly instituted a zero-tolerance policy for any form of hazing. A small, understated plaque was placed in the Marine Biology Building, in memory of Amelia Vance, 1985 to 2003. The dates were a presumption, an attempt at closure that felt like a lie. The professor who had been the faculty advisor for the senior marine biology students, a well-respected man named Dr. Alastair Croft, retired in 2011. He sold his house and moved to a quiet town in Vermont to be closer to his grandchildren. In a brief interview with the local paper, he expressed his deepest sympathies for the Vance family and his hope that they might one day find peace. He looked like a kind, grandfatherly academic. No one thought to question him further. By 2015, the case of the missing Ohio girl was little more than a ghost story whispered to incoming freshmen, a cautionary tale with no ending. Robert Vance still lived in his cottage, a gray-haired man who looked 20 years older than he was, still watching the sea, waiting for an answer it would never give. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 2019, 16 years after Amelia Vance disappeared. It was in a plain white envelope with a Boston postmark and no return address, addressed to the chief of police. The new chief, a sharp, determined woman named Jessica Harding, had been a rookie officer back in 2003. She'd been part of the search parties that combed the cliffs for Amelia. The case had been her first real taste of failure, and it had never left her. The letter contained a single sheet of paper with 4 short, block-printed sentences: "Amelia Vance is not in the ocean. She was buried. People lied. Check the old Croft property by the quarry." Harding felt a jolt, the kind that only comes when a dead case suddenly shows a flicker of a pulse. She immediately pulled the dusty case files. Dr. Alastair Croft, now 74 and still living in Vermont, had owned more than just his house in Port Clyde. A search of old property records revealed he'd owned a 100-acre parcel of undeveloped woodland about 20 miles inland, near an abandoned granite quarry. He'd bought it in 1999, citing botanical research, and had sold it in 2007 to a timber company. Harding drove out to the property herself. It was remote, accessible only by a long, overgrown logging road. The land was thick with pine and birch, and in the center of it stood the ruins of an old shed, its roof caved in. It was the perfect place to hide something. It was isolated, private, and no one would have had any reason to go there. Getting a warrant to excavate based on an anonymous letter after 16 years was a challenge, but Harding was persuasive. The specificity of the tip, naming Croft, mentioning the quarry, suggested it was more than just a crank. By May, a state police forensic team was on site with ground-penetrating radar. Harding made the difficult call to Robert Vance, carefully explaining that it might be nothing, that she didn't want to give him false hope. Robert's voice on the other end was quiet, weary, but for the first time in years, it held a spark of something other than despair. He said he'd be there. On the 3rd day, the radar picked up an anomaly. Near the crumbling foundation of the old shed, about 5 feet down, the screen showed a rectangular area of disturbed soil. The excavation began by hand, the forensic team meticulously scraping away layers of dirt and rock. Robert arrived on the 5th day, standing behind the police tape, a thin, stooped figure watching the slow, careful work with an unbearable mixture of dread and hope. They found her just before sunset. Wrapped in the tattered remains of a heavy canvas tarp were human bones. The forensic anthropologist on site knelt by the shallow grave and confirmed what they all knew. This was a burial, and it was old. The DNA confirmation came back from the state lab on June 3, 2019. A sample extracted from a tooth was a perfect match to the DNA Robert had provided from Amelia's hairbrush all those years ago. The remains belonged to Amelia Vance. The anthropologist's report also identified a cause of death, hypothermia, complicated by a significant blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. The injury alone might not have been fatal, but combined with prolonged exposure to the cold, it was a death sentence. This was no longer a missing person case. This was a homicide. Amelia Vance hadn't been lost to the sea. She had been killed, then deliberately and secretly buried, her memory left to be erased by time while her father searched for a ghost. Detective Harding looked at the file, at the old photos of the smiling, confident students and the kind-faced professor. For 16 years, they had built new lives on a foundation of lies. Now, she was going to tear it all down. Cole Murphy's confession gave Detective Sergeant Gallagher the leverage she needed, but leverage alone doesn't build a prosecutable case. She needed corroboration, physical evidence, and most critically, she needed the other participants to either confirm Murphy's account or contradict themselves in ways that revealed guilt. The challenge was that Murphy's statement, while emotionally powerful, had gaps and inconsistencies that a defense attorney would tear apart. He claimed not to remember certain details, protected some participants while naming others, and his timeline had holes that suggested either faulty memory or deliberate omission. Gallagher needed more, and she needed it before word spread that Murphy had talked, before the remaining conspirators could coordinate their stories or destroy whatever evidence might still exist after 16 years. Ryan Boyle was arrested at his home in Fort McMurray on August 29, 2019, taken into custody by RCMP officers at 6 in the morning before he left for work at the oil sands facility where he managed drilling operations. His wife watched from the doorway, their 3 children peering around her legs as Boyle was read his rights and placed in handcuffs. He said nothing during the arrest, his face blank with what might have been shock or might have been the sudden realization that the past had finally caught up. The warrant was based on Murphy's statement and the recovered emails that placed Boyle at the planning stages and the grain elevator on the night of October 17, 2003. During his interrogation in Edmonton, Boyle initially maintained silence, consulting with his attorney through every question. But the attorney was a criminal defense specialist who understood mathematics. 5 people had been involved, 1 had confessed and was cooperating. The first to follow Murphy would get better consideration from the Crown, the last would face the full weight of prosecution. Boyle broke after 6 hours, and his version of events aligned with Murphy's in most respects but diverged in crucial ways. Boyle admitted to making the phone call to Brett Morrison's dorm room, admitted to being present at the grain elevator, admitted to helping transport Brett to the access road. But his account of what happened after Brett fell into the well was different in tone and emphasis. Murphy had portrayed Fisher as taking charge, making decisions that the students had reluctantly followed. Boyle's version suggested the students had panicked and Fisher had been brought in specifically because they needed an authority figure to tell them what to do, someone whose judgment they could hide behind later. Boyle claimed that Fisher had examined Brett in the barn, had checked his pupils and his pulse, and had declared that the injury wasn't serious enough to warrant hospital intervention. Fisher had said hypothermia was the real danger and that warmth and rest would be sufficient. Boyle insisted they'd all believed Fisher, trusted his experience from years of fieldwork, and that when Brett died, it had seemed like a tragic miscalculation rather than criminal negligence. But even as Boyle told this version, Gallagher could see the self-justification, the need to believe they'd been misled rather than complicit. She didn't argue, she let him talk, recorded every word, and added his statement to the growing case file. Tyler Gordon was harder to locate. He'd moved to Australia in 2007, working in mining engineering in Western Australia, and extradition for a 16-year-old case was legally complex. But Gordon surprised everyone by voluntarily returning to Canada in September 2019 after being contacted by RCMP through Interpol channels. He arrived at Calgary Airport with his Australian wife and 2 suitcases, looking older than his 37 years, his face lined with something that resembled exhaustion. His lawyer, hired before he'd even landed, negotiated terms for his cooperation, and Gordon's statement was the most detailed and the most damning. He'd kept notes, he admitted, written in a journal that he'd hidden in his parents' basement in Lethbridge and never had the courage to destroy. The journal entries from October 2003 described the planning, the execution, and the aftermath in prose that was clinical and horrifying in its detachment. Gordon wrote that Fisher had seemed almost excited by the crisis, had taken control with an efficiency that suggested he'd considered contingencies like this before. Fisher had been the one who decided burial was the only option, who'd chosen the location on his property, who'd supervised the actual digging in the pre-dawn hours of October 18 while the students had taken turns with shovels they'd borrowed from the university's equipment shed. Marcus Hamilton, the 4th student named by Murphy, was dead. He died in a car accident in 2011, driving drunk on a highway outside of Red Deer, and whatever he might have testified to was lost with him. But his death added another layer of tragedy to the case, a reminder that the consequences of that October night had rippled forward in ways that destroyed more than just Brett Morrison's life. Hamilton's parents, contacted by Gallagher as part of the investigation, revealed that their son had struggled with addiction and depression for years after graduating, that he'd never seemed able to move past something that haunted him, though he'd never told them what. The implication was clear enough to devastate them all over again. Dr. Leonard Fisher was arrested on October 12, 2019, 16 years to the day after Brett Morrison disappeared. The arrest took place at Fisher's home in Nanaimo, a modest bungalow with a view of the ocean and a garden where he'd apparently spent his retirement cultivating native plants and watching eagles. He was 73 years old, physically frail in a way that made the arresting officers handle him gently despite the nature of the charges, and he showed no surprise when they arrived. His lawyer, a prominent criminal defense attorney from Vancouver named Sarah Lemoyne, had clearly been retained in advance, suggesting Fisher had known this was coming, perhaps had been waiting for it with the same inevitability that Murphy had described. Fisher was formally charged with criminal negligence causing death, accessory after the fact to manslaughter, indignity to human remains, and obstruction of justice. Travis Bauer, whose name had appeared throughout the investigation as the primary organizer, was arrested the same day at his home in Kelowna, British Columbia, where he worked as a forestry consultant. His arrest was complicated by the fact that he'd become a successful professional, well regarded in his field, married with 4 children, and his fall from grace was precipitous and public. Local media in Kelowna covered the story extensively, the shocking revelation that this man who'd coached Little League and served on the town planning committee had been involved in the death and cover-up of a fellow student 16 years earlier. Bauer's wife filed for divorce within weeks, his employer terminated his contract, and his defense strategy, when it became clear, was to claim diminished culpability, to argue that he'd been 21 and stupid, following the lead of an authority figure he trusted, and that the real criminal was Fisher, who'd manipulated impressionable students into participating in his cover-up. The trial of Dr. Alastair Croft began on March 8, 2021, in a small county courthouse that was overwhelmed by the sudden influx of media. Robert Vance sat in the front row every single day, a quiet, stoic ghost from the past, there to bear witness. The prosecution, led by a sharp state prosecutor named Maria Santos, meticulously laid out the events of that October night and the 16 years of deception that followed. Leo Martinez was the first to testify, his voice thick with emotion as he recounted the events, his guilt palpable. On cross-examination, Croft's lawyer tried to paint him as an unreliable narrator trying to save his own skin, but Leo's remorse was so genuine it seemed to fill the room. He looked at Robert Vance and apologized, saying he had lived in a prison of his own making for 16 years. Ben Carter's testimony was even more explosive, as the prosecution entered his handwritten journal into evidence. Passages were read aloud, a chilling, real-time account of a group of young men making a series of catastrophic decisions. An entry from October 18, 2003 read, "Dr. C said it was a choice between our futures and his. He made it sound like a simple equation. We chose us. I don't know how we live with that." Dr. Croft's defense argued that he had made a terrible error in judgment, not a criminal act. They claimed he had genuinely believed Amelia's injury was not life-threatening and that her death from hypothermia was an unforeseeable tragedy. Croft himself took the stand, a frail, 75-year-old man in an oversized suit, and tearfully admitted to the cover-up, calling it a moment of profound panic and moral failure. He insisted, however, that he had not caused Amelia's death, only hidden it. But under Santos's relentless cross-examination, his story crumbled. She produced the emails showing he had suggested the remote location days before the initiation, asking why he would pre-select an isolated spot if he wasn't anticipating the need for secrecy. He had no answer. The jury deliberated for 4 days. When they returned, they found Dr. Alastair Croft guilty of criminal negligence causing death, accessory after the fact, and obstruction of justice. He was acquitted of the more serious charge of manslaughter. At his sentencing, he was given 20 years in prison, a life sentence for a man his age. Evan Driscoll was tried separately and received a 15-year sentence for his role as the ringleader. Leo Martinez and Ben Carter, in exchange for their testimony, received sentences of 5 and 7 years. Robert Vance was given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement. He stood at the podium, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded a piece of paper. He spoke not of anger, but of the vast, hollow emptiness of the 16 years of not knowing. "You didn't just take my daughter's life," he said, his voice quiet but steady, looking directly at Croft. "You took her memory. You buried her in a place of shame and left me to search every face in every crowd, hoping to see hers. You stole my chance to mourn." Amelia Vance was finally brought home to Ohio in the summer of 2021. She was buried in a small cemetery next to her mother. The headstone was simple, bearing her name, her dates, and a line Robert had chosen from a poem she loved, Andromeda, strained and radiant, still shines. Her story was no longer a ghost story whispered on a college campus, but a tragedy that had finally, after 16 long years, found its truth.